All right, so we're at the end, really, in many ways, of the sort of Keynesian section of the course, and even sort of got a little bit into what we might refer to as the neoclassical synthesis, even though we sort of never really kind of stated that within the context of a lecture. But when you look at that combination of ISLM analysis, goods money market equilibrium, and then the way in which it creates the aggregate demand curve, and then the sort of conception of aggregate supply, and those different conceptions of aggregate supply that we've already talked about. Horizontal when things aren't generally going very well. Slightly vertical, or I'm sorry, upward sloping when things are going fairly well, and then over the long run, we expect the economy, or even just when the economy reaches full employment. I think that's sort of one of the more important sort of ideas here, is that sort of from Keynes' perspective, there is sort of a full employment level of the economy. That's a classical idea, that there is this full employment level. The distinction, of course, with the classicals was that Keynes argued that there are fluctuations in employment away from that natural level, and that there is perhaps no reason for us to assume that the labor market will get pushed back towards full employment, or that if unemployment moves away from so-called natural rate, or away from full employment, then the argument would be that the economy may stay there. There may be an extended period of unemployment, and that ultimately that extended period of unemployment would be, in a sense, seen as lost time, right? I mean, that's kind of one of the sort of arguments that Keynes makes, is that even if you buy the idea that the economy is going to equilibrate back to some long run level of full employment, the sort of idea would be that if you allowed that to occur, if you allowed that equilibration to occur so-called naturally, that the time it takes to get there may, in fact, turn down your long-run economic growth trajectory. Basically, the idea would be is that it's like getting sick, but the sickness could potentially be something that becomes debilitating if you don't, in a sense, take care of it. And in the Keynesian world, taking care of it was aggregate demand management. And so that's why ultimately this ISLM model that you see in front of you ends up being almost all you really need in the sort of Keynesian sense, because the idea here is that whatever there is equilibrium in the goods and money market as represented by ISLM, that equilibrium, which we assume is always going to be true, that was sort of, again, that's a classical idea that Keynes brings in. Keynes argues that the full economy may not necessarily be in equilibrium at full employment. In other words, there may be cyclical unemployment, but he still believed that the goods market and money market would be in equilibrium at essentially a recessionary level of output. So if we look at the Y here, is that Y does not necessarily mean full employment when ISLM is in equilibrium. ISLM in equilibrium, in fact, just means that the goods and money markets are in equilibrium. If the broader economic system itself is dysfunctional, then the equilibrium in ISLM will also reflect that dysfunctionality, where when we refer to dysfunctionality, we mean lower output than what the economy essentially wants to be at. You have to understand, Keynes very much saw recessionary periods as off normality, that recessions and these really big boom periods, that these were, in a sense, rare events, but consistent economic growth was, in sort of a sense, the more consistent narrative. So that when the economy did grow especially fast, or contract especially quickly, then this is where we get this idea of demand management. Now, it's also important to see that there's a nice little layer of complexity. We've already talked about the sort of idea of the IS and the LM curves having their own elasticities. So in terms of the goods market, we can think about scenarios in which consumers are very sensitive to prices or not very sensitive to prices. And then the same thing in terms of interest rate. I should say interest rates. I don't know why I said prices. Interest rates. And then in the money market, again, how responsive is the money market to changes in interest rates? It's important for us to kind of, and this is what I'm doing with this particular video, to sort of just establish what is a relatively simple and what we might sort of argue is the kind of canonical story of kind of the ISLM with respect to Keynes's perspective of an economy below potential output. So let's sort of start from the perspective here that the goods and money market are currently in equilibrium right here. Oh, let me get an actual marker here. So we'll just call this E for the sort of current equilibrium. And the current equilibrium is producing this level of GDP. We'll just call this Y0. And what we're going to establish here is that Y0 is less than Y bar. So we are currently below potential employment, meaning that we have cyclical unemployment in the economic system. So then the sort of conversation becomes, okay, so we know that we can reduce cyclical unemployment by boosting aggregate demand, right? So the policy goal for us is going to be to boost aggregate demand because remember, in the Keynesian world, demand creates supply. So if you boost aggregate demand, you're going to increase pressure on businesses to make things and hire people that they otherwise would not have done had you not boosted aggregate demand. So basically, the idea here is that we're going to keep the economy running, or we're going to sort of increase the speed at which the economy is running, specifically by boosting aggregate demand. And then the question becomes, how are we going to do that? Because we have two different ways that we can do that, right? We can use expansionary monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve central bank can increase the money supply, or they could pursue, lower interest rate targeting. Those tools of the central bank that would be considered expansionary. Or the government, the executive branch, I should say, the federal government can boost the economy through fiscal policy, so increasing government spending or cutting taxes. Is the way we could do that on the fiscal side. So from sort of Keynes' perspective, it was not only sort of enough that we established that you can boost aggregate demand through monetary or fiscal policy, but also that Keynes had an idea of what is probably going to be the preferred policy. And in order to understand sort of Keynes' perspective here, we just have to put the elasticities of the IS and LM curves where they would be under sort of Keynes's narrative of an economy in dysfunction. So the narrative of an economy in dysfunction is essentially that in the goods market, people have become less sensitive to changes in interest rates. And the reason why that is because during recessionary peak periods, people become very precautionary about essentially their demand for money. And so when their demand for money, in a sense, is unresponsive now to interest rate policy, then what that's ultimately going to do is it's going to cause the LM curve to really flatten, right? So and what this means is that in the sort of money market, with respect to changes in the interest rate, the money market becomes very responsive. So the LM curve becomes more elastic. Okay, so the idea here is that now the sort of response from the money market is heightened. They are more sensitive to interest rate changes on the money market side. I think I started out with the IS curve, and then that might have been confusing for a moment. So let me take a step back here, rewind, and say, okay, so what's going on here is that during recessionary periods, people become more precautious about how they choose to hold and save money, and so as a result, they become more sensitive to interest rates on the money market side. So the LM curve becomes more elastic. That means it flattens. The money market becomes more responsive to interest rate changes. And then the exact opposite is going on in the goods market. And the reason why the goods market is becoming less responsive to interest rate changes is because people are just generally starting to save more because we're starting to be in economic dysfunction. So if the economy is slipping into a recession, we expect savings to go up. As a result, we expect consumption to decline, and we expect investment also, right, to decline as well. Because people become more uncertain, they become more concerned about the economy sort of moving forward. And so as a result, now the goods market becomes less responsive to interest rate changes. So basically the uncertainty and the fear of the economic contraction causes the money market to become more reactive to interest rate changes, and it causes the goods market to become less reactive to interest rate changes. So the IS curve is very inelastic, and the LM curve is very elastic. Now, in that world, it's not difficult for us to see what would be sort of the preferred policy in the context of what is going to ultimately boost aggregate demand the most, what is actually going to get us to full employment quicker. And so, assuming that full employment might be somewhere like here, so we just sort of that's where full employment would be. Then we can see that if we do fiscal policy is of course going to cause a rightward shift of the IS curve, and so we can see here at A. I'm just going to kind of draw a very small IS curve shift. So IS curve is going to shift in that direction. And you can see that the movement and output is pretty big. And then if we compare this to the world where we instead have a monetary policy expansion, so the LM curve would be shifting out like right here. So LM is shifting out here. You can see now that due to the elasticities, the output improvement from monetary policy is much smaller than the output improvement from fiscal policy. And so the sort of idea here is that if we are indeed pretty far below full employment here, Y bar, then the quickest way for us to get back to Y bar is going to be through the fiscal policy transmission mechanism. So the government pursues stimulus, cuts taxes. This puts money directly into people's pocketbooks. The idea is that consumption is going to be buoyed, investment is going to be buoyed by the fiscal expansion, and then, and importantly, this is kind of like the nice important part here, is that this shift of the IS curve, and typically one of the costs of shifting the IS curve is that you put upward pressure on interest rates. Well, you can see here that that increase in interest rates would be very small. So you only get a very sort of uptick in interest rates, but you get a comparatively large boost in output as a result. So from Keynes's perspective, fiscal policy was preferred to monetary policy during economic contractions because his belief was that the IS curve, which again, remember, Keynes didn't know about the IS curve, but what became the Keynesian IS curve becomes steeper during recessions, and the Keynesian LM curve becomes flatter during recessions. Now, to what extent this is true, and therefore, to what extent is policy, fiscal policy, preferred to monetary policy, is of course, up for both theoretical and empirical debate. But I would say that this is probably certainly something that contemporary modern economists feel pretty good about. And so this is one of the reasons why economists came out in such force for fiscal stimulus during the COVID recession, because the concern is that basically monetary policy was going to be a lot less effective at boosting the economy than fiscal stimulus would be. And I think there's a lot of really solid evidence to support that particular argument. Now, The playoff here, the trade off is that if you get a bigger boost to aggregate demand, then for any upward sloping aggregate supply, so for any aggregate supply that's not horizontal, you're going to get inflationary pressure, and the larger the boost to aggregate demand, the more inflationary pressure you would get. And so therefore, in a world where perhaps you believe that aggregate supply kind of is horizontal for some period and then maybe goes vertical here. So boosting aggregate demand from here to here is certainly going to put inflationary pressure on the economy. And of course, fiscal policy, because it boosts aggregate demand even more, is going to ultimately put even more inflationary pressure on the economy than would monetary policy. And so it isn't that there aren't trade-offs here. There certainly are. But if the goal is like an immediate boost to the economic system, then fiscal policy is good, not just from this sort of theoretical position of the IS and LM curves having particular elasticities, but also this comes down to time lag. And there's a real sense that fiscal policy has a much lower time lag than monetary policy. The monetary policy time lag has probably been reduced over time due to velocity of money increasing quite a bit. But it's still the case that we believe pretty strongly that in terms of time lag, fiscal policy has a much smaller time lag than does monetary policy. And so this is sort of ultimately why Keynesians, despite the trade-off with inflation, believe that fiscal policy is the more preferred expansionary policy when the economy is in economic dysfunction. However, because fiscal policy is going to give you a bigger boost to aggregate demand, I would also argue that the modern economist would say you have to also be especially concerned that if you boost aggregate demand, you're going to potentially add considerable inflationary pressure to the economy, which may be completely fine from the economic perspective, but might bring in some interesting political consequences. And again, kind of gets us back to that political business cycle that we talked about, with federal governments having an incentive to run very expansionary fiscal policy, but very expansionary fiscal policy is inflationary. And so very often these sort of activist governments with a lot of stimulus, a lot of tax cuts, very often also want the monetary policy side to sort of play ball. They want kind of accommodative monetary policy as a result. That's very non-Keynesian, right? The Keynesian argument would be, let's juice the economy with fiscal policy if the economy is in dysfunction, and then let's use monetary policy to keep inflation in line with where we are. So the most likely sort of pursuit here is expansionary fiscal policy. And then eventually, at some point in the future, when the economy has recovered, most likely contractionary monetary policy to keep inflation in line. And again, if you go back to 2021 through 2024, this is where I think people really perhaps are not as optimistic about policy as they should be, because we got that big boost to output that we wanted through fiscal stimulus. It certainly caused a considerable amount of inflation, but then the Fed was able to certainly help manage that inflation by contractionary monetary policy, to the extent that we even got that soft landing that a lot of people didn't think was necessarily possible. Now, I think there's probably certainly some policy luck that allowed. I don't think it was all just smart people in the room making those decisions. But I think if you look at the COVID sort of story, especially in the US, it is very much a Keynesian story. And also very much a story that, depending upon where you fall politically, you could use that quote unquote Keynesian narrative to suit your political purposes. So conservatives might be quick to say, oh, look, Keynesian policy caused a bunch of inflation. Which is true, but not necessarily a bad thing. And then liberals might say, oh, look, Keynesian policy caused the economy to grow a lot. So, and then the concern there would be that they sort of fall too in love with just increases in government spending, right? So there's ways these things can be bent politically, but I think economically, if we look at what happened sort of post-COVID, it's actually a very good story, despite, of course, the relative horror of the whole thing.